Definitely try to use point of service documentation. It's always like, oh, point of service, how do you do that? Point of service is meant to save the therapist time. It does, it saves us time. If you go to a doctor's office, they usually have their laptop right there and everyone is doing point of service documentation, or even like a PT is using a goniometer. They have to use different equipment. Well, our equipment is a computer tablet. And to engage the patients in therapy. One thing we do is we actually provide surveys to our patients. And one of the interesting things for the surveys is patients did not feel like they were goal setting themselves. So by doing point of service documentation, you're actually able to allow the patients to help set their own goals. Just like if you go to a gym, you set a goal this week, I'm gonna run a mile, next week I'm gonna run 2. Well, that's achieving your own goal. And if you're not able to allow them to help set those goals, the achievements can look different and the outcomes can look different. So for ask for documentation, a point of service is so important just to engage your patients, build a relationship with them, talk to them, and it's more accurate.
I think initially, especially when you would go into a doctor's office, for instance, and they're spending very little time talking to you and a lot of time on an iPad, for instance, that is off-putting, I think, as a patient initially, but I do think that folks are kind of used to that at this point, and the key, again, is to be in direct intervention with that patient the entire time that you have them. And so the documentation is less a specific experience for them and more something that's just part of the treatment.
Sure, I think just not having the computer in a good place, like when you're doing things with patients, like you should have good body mechanics, have a desk with you, make it flow. It's awkward when you're like running back to a computer and then going back to your patient. So just having it with you so it's not like a barrier to your session, more like it flows with your session. And then just keeping goals in mind, like you should know what you're gonna be looking at before you sit down with that patient for that day. So you can kind of start assessing as soon as you're pulling things up, and it's not like you're kind of starting from scratch with it, like having an idea of what you're gonna be looking at before.
So I would say the reasons that some people say it doesn't work is because they feel like, they are always looking at the iPad, they're not able to focus on the patient, or that it's a really hands-on treatment, so they're not able to document during the treatment time always are the biggest challenges.
Do you feel comfortable sharing your responses to that?
I would say what I would do is, even though you're doing documentation at the same time, you're incorporating it into the treatment. And just explaining to the patient, I may be using my iPad, but I'm not ignoring you, I'm listening to you, I'm just jotting things down so I can make sure I have an accurate picture of what we're doing today.
Great. Do you feel that the point of service documentation is the number one way to address productivity with a therapy team, or is there something else that comes to mind that might be a close second, third, or take that number one spot?
I think it's a big part of it, because I think that's what we spend most of our non-productive time doing is documentation. So if you can do it during your treatment sessions, do point of service documentation, it really helps your day go a lot smoother.
Well, I think that the key there is if you can use graded challenges, whether it's cognition or even strengthening, that's the opportunity to do that in your treatment plan for that day, is to actually have them where you're directly involved, but that does give you time to document. And that really is actually very helpful. And if you plan your treatment around that, and then you've got your documentation done, then you can do other things in the treatment session.
Great.
I also like to start by just educating my patients and telling them what I'm doing on the iPad and letting them know I'm documenting, our treatment today, so that we can have a good plan of care, and when they're having downtime, they're resting, I'll document. So while they're doing stuff and while we're interacting, my head's not down on the iPad, I'm interacting with them.
Yeah, I try, and it depends on schedule and how many patients you have to see, what the flexibility is with this. But if I'm seeing a patient a couple times a week, I want to have an idea of their goals and be looking at that throughout the week. So when I'm doing the note, it's not like I'm starting from scratch and have no idea where we are. So if there's an outcome assessment, I try to keep that in mind when we're doing things. If there's something that we can do earlier, like get some steps in, go on a walk outside, try a car transfer, I try to do that throughout the week so that when I'm doing the documentation, I already have an idea of what their status is on a lot of those things. Just because it's hard to address every single goal and type everything out and talk to the patient about the plan of care in a limited amount of time. So I try to kind of keep that in mind on every treatment session and not just the paperwork ones. Yeah, I think it's important to have a really good relationship with the assistants you're working with and have them doing the goals throughout the week. You really want to address like having them set up the maybe walking outside, having them set up the home eval, having them do a lot of the things that you're going to need, and then have them report back to you. You can kind of decide what you need to see again, what else you guys need to work on, but making sure that they're really driving the plan of care that you and the patient have set up so the patient can make functional gains and get out sooner and kind of achieve what they want. So I'd say that that's the biggest part, having them document well what they're doing so that you can refer back to it too.
I think on a regular basis, when you're going through the goals with the patient, it helps them know what we're working towards. So they don't just think, oh, what is this doing for me? Why am I doing this? What's the purpose? They see the reason for it, they understand why we're doing it, and it makes it a really meaningful session then.
I think as we're switching, like everyone's talking about, to point of care documentation, there is that point where you begin to question, or at least initially, when this was all taking place 5-10 years ago even, what is it that they're going to take away from this, that being the patient? How do they feel about you're sitting in front of them doing this paperwork? So I think that as people are more, I mean, you go to the doctor's office, that's what you experience. Mm-hmm. So as people are more acclimated to that, then I think that the productivity is, I mean, that's just part of it. So
I think it's finding a happy medium of treating the patient and making them understand that this is the new way, the new process, and allowing them to be part of that process, I think helps them feel better about it.
What would you say the benefit to the patient? So if you had to go in and tell them, these are the 3 benefits to us doing point of service documentation to you, what would your top 3, or throw out a couple
I
ideas?
think exactly what you said, the buy-in.
Okay,
Yeah,
buy-in.
exactly.
Yeah. And I think the accuracy. I think it's so much more accurate when it's right there with the patient. You're actually taking verbatim from what they say, like my home life is, or discharge plans, or what my goals are. So I think the accuracy part is just so much more beneficial.
It allows our therapists to get outside of that cookie cutter goals, create those goals that are catered to that patient itself, and I think that allows for some interesting treatments for the patient.
I think it also makes the patient feel like they're not just a number. We're sitting down with them and reviewing their goals and their treatment plan, and so I think it gives them the opportunity to feel like we truly do care, and that's why we're all here, is to improve their quality of life.
Do you feel like the 5 years ago versus today, do you feel like our patients do feel more engaged because of the point of service and the approach that's being taken? Do you feel like the patients feel the difference?
I think so, because I think we're making our plan of care much more patient-centered. You know, when I was doing paper documentation and at the end of the day I'm filling these things out, it was definitely more like, this is just the script that you use and these are the general goals that you write. Now, it's much more specific to the patient. They can actually be a part of the process and really understand why they're here, why we're doing this, and what they're going to get out of it.
And compared to 5 years ago, patients aren't staying as long in the facility as they were 5 years ago. So it's like you have to get in and get that plan of care started immediately to discharge the patient appropriately in appropriate settings. So I think, it's a faster process today.
So we talked a little bit about our patients, the team, students. How about you personally? Do you feel like having point of service documentation and having that schedule and some of the improvements that have happened, what does that do for your quality of life and your start to finish in your workday?
Well, it helps, you know, if you're able to do the point of service documentation, you're not staying after work for hours completing all your notes. You know, you're finished treating and you're basically done for the day. You can go home and get back to your home life and, you know, spend more time with your family.
It's very much a sense of accomplishment to know that you're caught up for the day. You're not starting 4 steps behind when you come in the next morning. And so for me, it's so much nicer than when, you know, we were on paper and constantly behind.
And it helps avoid the scribbles on a paper and incorporating that to another sheet later. And then when you have such a high flow facility where you have 2-3 evaluations a day and you don't know patient A from B, you know, it makes those goals more specific if you do it in point of service versus the end of the day.